what Hart did not say in his talk. I think one of the most interesting chapters of the book is chapter 3, Constituting the Common, and here we find some really interesting highlights of the Hart and Negri's understanding of what these camps, these occupations are really sort of signifying to us from a theoretical standpoint. On the one hand, there's this fantastic declaration of principles. Now, if you remember, Hart in his talk was talking about how the Declaration and the Constitution were like this, heart of silver in a frame of gold, or heart of gold in a frame of silver. This was, I think, based on some quote from Abraham Lincoln. Why was he focusing on declaration so much? Where was this sort of emphasis on the Constitution having to sort of play second fiddle to the Declaration coming from? Well, because the Declaration is the point of affirmation, right? The Constitution is nothing without the affirmation. The Constitution should be an open and liquid process to constantly check in with ourselves to make sure that we're living in accordance with the principles of our Declaration, right? So, and if the principles of our Declaration are not being satisfied, then the Constitution, the constitutional process, has broken, and we should reform it. We should mend it. And so the Constitution has to be read through the lens of the Declaration, and it has to be made to function relative to the principles of the Declaration. Now, so what in the book Declaration, we find a much greater depth and an understanding of what the Declaration is vis-a-vis the current moment. We find Hart and Negri arguing in this wonderful language. I think it's kind of interesting, it's very powerful language. They're evoking the original Jeffersonian Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are equal, that they have acquired through political struggle certain inalienable rights, that among these are not only life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but also free access to the common, equality in the distribution of wealth, and sustainability of the common, a reference there at the end to the environment. So the encampments are this great constitutionally relevant phenomena, say Hart and Negri. They are, with the Declaration stated, the constitutional process of putting these principles into our lives is underway, and the encampments attest to that. So they attest to that because of their ability to kind of escape out of the usual lockdown that power struggles are often sort of ending up in. And when I say lockdown, I mean basically that you have a proposition and an opposition, and there's a kind of a stalemate between the two of them, and they sort of have to battle each other out. But this binary of power, I think the camps, because they don't bother to attack the state, or they don't bother to attack capitalism, they literally encamp and they enact a new form of life. This is what Hart and Negri call a new ontological condition, or a new way of living. It's enacted right there in the street. It's not an attack on government. It's not a violent sort of effort to overthrow government. It's not a revolution in that sense, right? So in this sense, we escape the logic of power, and we find ourselves past power on the other side. We haven't succumbed to the temptation to challenge it directly. We just sort of basically acted as if it wasn't there. And that's why Hart and Negri sort of suggest, I think, that defeat isn't really enough to reverse the cause of the common at this stage, that because this glimpse of an other possible life has been glimpsed now, has been made visible to everyone now, that you can't put the genie back in the bottle once that's happened. So there's some things that sort of characteristics of the encampments that I'd like to go through with you today, and they're really, really interesting. They give a lot of depth to the talk. that Hart gave last week. And so the first one is this notion of autonomous time, and it's basically speaking to the idea of the value of the camp as a mode of engaging in protest, in contrast with the kind of mode that was presented to us by, say, the Seattle 1999 protest against the World Trade Organization, which was a street protest that sort of tried to chase, if you will, the convention or the World Trade Organization meetings all over the world. So those protests were not camps, they were not encampments, they were not occupations of space. One of the virtues of the occupation of space, of the instantiation of a kind of a community in a sort of a solid envelope of space, is that it allows them to kind of be in this kind of new ontological condition that we just mentioned. You know, as I've said it here in my words, it allows the occupiers to be over it already, right? In Hart and Negri's language, it's better to say it as the camp is elsewhere even when it shares the same space, right? So this means that the camp is kind of, well, elsewhere, but I mean, obviously physically they're there. But I think what we mean is politically elsewhere, right? They're already living in the future, so to speak. They're living in another time, they're living in another space politically. And that's, for Hart and Negri, the essence of an alternative is to actually sort of live it. And I think certainly there's some merits to that point, it would seem. Another thing about time, the slowing down of time, the fact that the camps were able to seize their own time, to do things on their own terms, it allowed for proximity, it allowed for slowness, the cultivation of relationships, the sharing of excitement. And there's this wonderful quote here: an occupation is a kind of happening, a performance piece that generates political affects. So there's a kind of, I mean, Michael Hart in his lecture spoke about art and the centrality of art as a sort of a guiding philosophy for understanding the encampments. I think there's something to that. The idea that the camps were kind of a factory or a training ground for the occupiers, that they would, in a sense, be learning how to make decisions together. They would be learning how to be together, to be amongst each other, and be excited together, I think is very important. And none of that would have been possible were it not for the time that the camps gave them to do that. So time is a very important factor for Hart and Negri in relation to these questions. But they say it's not enough just to have a beautiful process. So in another section they discuss the need for counterpowers, and I think this is one of the areas in his talk that he didn't really go into at all. Even the Magna Carta, they say in the book, needed a charter of the forest. And the charter of the forest, of course, well, the Magna Carta, you may know, is the original sort of Bill of Rights that gives people the right to protection and free process, habeas corpus rights in the face of sovereign power, suggesting that the sovereign couldn't just do anything he or she wanted, that they had to respect a certain sort of code of ethics, a code of behavior. And so that the parallel here between our own time is not too hard to see if you think about it. The Magna Carta is the constituent process, and the Charter of the Forest is the actual physical institutionalized result that was achieved. You know, like an actual tangible goal. So it's not just enough to have a process. You know, you need to have some kind of physical, tangible result from the process. So the constituent process, they say, needs counterpowers in order to be able to actually grab the things that need to happen in the short term, because some of these things are urgent, right? And you can't wait for idealized processes, for beautiful processes, beautiful occupations to spread and become the process of the whole world. You actually do need to act now for certain things. So you know, the environment, for example, is rapidly decaying. A lot of people are hungry. There's a lack of healthcare. There's a lack of shelter, and we live in a permanent war society. So all these things need to be acted on, and counterpowers are important here. So what sort of options do we have? What should we do to think about counterpowers and creating an armament for ourselves of counterpowers? Well, they say that some old institutions are useful. Not everything of the old needs to be thrown out. The legal means of national and international systems are a kind of counterpower for them. But the problem is they're limited because the corporations are very good at getting around them. And the sort of abstraction, the abstract flows and logics of globalization mean that the nation state is pretty powerless today. So those institutions are only going to be so useful. They're not going to be the solid solution for everything. So Hart and Negri believe that something more global and sort of powerful is needed that's capable of taking on the corporations in no uncertain terms. But they say how this will come about is not clear to us. Now, that's really interesting to me because Hart avoided this, I think, in his talk to some extent. I don't remember him in his talk talking about how he wants to sort of let this question of the counterpowers sort of leave it up to those in the encampments, in the movements. But certainly, I think he is suggesting that it's going to be down to the protesters themselves to invent this. That they're not going to. Hart and Negri aren't exactly going to be giving advice about how this is going to happen. I guess because they don't see it as their job. That they're not the ones putting their selves on the line. Their job in this division of labor is a little bit different. But they do suggest that counterpower has to be a broad enough concept because the reality is a lot of these encampments they're subject to tremendous police brutality and attacks from other quarters of society, so they're going to need to be able to defend themselves somehow, and that is to say that if violence is used against them, maybe there'll need to be some kind of some sort of mechanism to prevent the movement being squashed through violent means. So of course non-violent forms of protest are going to be relevant there. That's your preference. But if you're being attacked with guns and heavy ammunition, then you may need to have to figure out either a very good way of entrenching and defending yourself if you want to stay faithful to your non-violent means, or you may actually have to end up responding with violence yourself. So I think one of the reasons why Hart maybe steered clear of this is because of where this question leads. We're kind of uncomfortable talking about that aspect of it. But that's not to say Hart is advocating violence. It's just simply to say that I think he's respecting the fact that violence might be a decision that those in common end up having to make. Unfortunately, they probably don't want to, and they would recognize that to a certain extent that's contradicting the goal of preserving the common. But they do have to survive. They must not let themselves be physically destroyed or eliminated. So that's important. I don't think Hart's a pacifist per se, and so that's just something to think about. Anyway, he says, we have no satisfying response to this, only the conviction that the patient constituent processes must be complemented by immediately acting counterpowers. And I think he believes that the rest of that question is really up to those protesting. Another key factor or dimension of the constituting of the common comes through communication. They note that social networks must be open. They tell some stories about how in Spain the constituent movements went to court to try to protect the openness of social networks. And there's something that's telling here insofar as the networks, the multitudes desire the networks to remain open because one of the things about them is they are the cognitive precariat, right? They are the cognitive laborers whose contracts are precarious and who find themselves in a materially feeble position, even though intellectually they're very strong, and their form of labor is hegemonic in the production process today. So even though maybe they don't have tanks and guns and bombs, they are very powerful in the process today, and they are sort of they do mark the emergence of a kind of an intellectual if you want to call it this, an intellectual proletariat. They use the term cognitive precariat. Intellectual proletariat's fine by me if that's what you want. You know, there's obviously a threat there, or a risk there to the capitalism, because if government or the state were to sort of intrude upon them to repress them, well, that would actually contradict what they are. You know, they are people who make value through the use of the common and the process of innovation in the common, which mean that they need a certain freedom to be able to do that, because they work non-linearly, right? They need freedom. You can't, working linearly is the Fordist model, but if I'm going to be asked to create some kind of cool new widget for Google or something, I'm going to need to be able to be free. That's what we talked about, how Google HQ is kind of a fun place to work, you know, with people riding around in scooters and PlayStation games that you can play on. Well, that's because the more people feel at home, the more comfortable they are, the more creative they can be, right? They're less harassed than constrained they feel by their workplace environment. That's why people are sometimes allowed to work at home, although I noticed this week that Yahoo said that they weren't really keen on letting people work at home anymore, but I wonder if that's kind of a backlash, and that might be short-lived, because more and more other people are actually content to have workers working at home. So we'll see what happens there. That's something we can't really predict. But yeah, I mean, so the nation state can only repress a cognitive proletariat so much before they cease to be able to make value according to the way capitalism wants them to make value today. So there's a contradiction there, and it's a contradiction that favors the cognitive precariat, because the cognitive precariat, you know, politically is thriving under conditions of relative freedom, and so it's not clear at all how that genie can be put back in the bottle. I think for Hart and Negri, there's no chance that that's going to happen. So, and then another thing is the relationship between realism, or realpolitik, or raison d'etat, and democracy, right? So typically in the past, people like Henry Kissinger have been able to tell us without you know, breaking a sweat, that you know, democracy is something for domestic life, and realism, or raison d'etat, is something for our external foreign policy. But what the communication breakthrough, or communication revolution, is showing is that the revolution is changing foreign policy as well. That governments can't keep information locked down anymore. That there's a genuine desire on the part of the cognitive precariat for openness, and there's a sort of a sense that the democratic multitudes in Egypt, the democratic multitudes in America, Britain, that they all want this, right? They all want WikiLeaks. They all want to learn about what their governments have been keeping from them. And so WikiLeaks just released, obviously, thousands of documents implicating a multitude of governments around the world, and especially Egypt, Israel, United States, Ireland, you name it, right? People found out what their governments were really doing behind their backs, and they were not impressed, right? So communication has a huge role to play in constituting the con. Another interesting discussion that comes out of this wonderful little book declaration is the protection of minorities point for Hart and Negri. There's an interesting sort of linkage with Madisonian theories of democracy. Madison, of course, being one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. He, of course, and Noam Chomsky is always giving out about this, so if you really want some details on this, you can read almost any book by Noam Chomsky. Madison famously says that pure democracy is just the most ridiculous and terrible idea because of the tyranny of the majority principle. You know, this is something J.S. Mill talks about a lot, and also Rousseau talks a lot about. The idea that, you know, if the masses are poor, they will act as poor people. They will not act rationally. They will act from a sort of an entrenched position, a biased position. And the key thing Madison says is that we need to protect minorities. We need to protect religious minorities. We need to protect the wealthy from the irrational boisterousness of the multitudes. But what Hart and Negri suggests is that the Occupy camps showed us that, in fact, this this need not be so. That there was a lot of experimentation and efforts towards differential inclusion. If you've ever seen videos of an occupation in session, you know, people are using these different sort of hand gestures to show a sort of a quick-moving process of making decisions and that kind of thing. And actually, I have to say, I participated in a couple of these things and I saw them in operation. It's really fascinating to see how a large number of people can have a complex debate about issues and can engage in decision making in this sort of highly consensualistic way. This isn't really the class or the context at the time to go into that in a lot of detail, but we can certainly talk about it in class if you like. So there's a question there that maybe Madison is not correct, that minorities need to be protected from democracy. That maybe the occupations show that through differential inclusion, through the principle of accommodating difference, that you know, maybe democracy has a lot to commend it after all. So and anyway, say Hart and agree, why would you want to put religious and economic minorities on the same level? Obviously, people want to protect religious practice. That's something that they would be central. But you wouldn't want to protect an economic minority. It's not really appropriate. Like, you know, a millionaire or a billionaire is not exactly the same as a persecuted religious minority. There's a bit of a difference there. One is being sort of set upon and marginalized by the masses for their religious values and beliefs. The other is being set upon for being an elite. Sort of quite the different sort of category, aren't they? One, you know, elites aren't exactly you know, hard up for protection. So anyway, another factor then that comes in is if protection of minorities is not so much to consider then as a risk or a threat, then let's consider the plural ontology of politics as the way through which all these different agendas, these different groups, these different minorities are going to be incorporated all as part of the same cycle. Their struggles, whether it's Egypt, Tahrir Square, Occupy Wall Street in America or in Ireland, these groups are all part of the same cycle. They all have the same enemy, say Hart and agree, which I think they're kind of preemptively stating this because a lot of people would say that's Hart and Negri's classic mistake, you know, that they're trying to sort of subsume all of these different struggles into one struggle. And Hart and Negri are aware of this criticism, but they're insisting that there is a way of thinking about all these struggles as basically struggles against the same enemy. You have the indebted figure, you have the mediated figure, you have the securitized figure, and you have the represented figure, as I've got here, DMSR. And those figures crop up in all of the conflicts. So that's relevant. That there are these sort of commonalities of the experience of the fight. So it's the same enemy, right? But second, and I guess more philosophically, more than sort of empirically, and this is sort of the second time we've seen them make this argument, because of course they made it earlier, didn't they? That there's a sort of a philosophical unity, not just a sort of a the intellectuals weren't just visiting each other's encampments. There was also a sort of a philosophical unity in the horizontalism that they were all engaging. So we see that crop up again here. That the different practices and goals of all these different struggles can combine as a shared project that has a plural ontology, or a plural shared project that fosters a common terrain of struggle. So one of the things we're going to see here, and on the next slide we find this mention of a term, federalism. So here we go. Federalism is the name that Hart and Negri do use to try to describe this terrain of similarity between the different struggles. Different goals combine with a cooperative and federative logic of assembly to create a model of constituent democracy in which these differences are able to interact and connect. The fact of the matter is, Hart and Negri are aware that some of these struggles are quite disparate, right? They have different contexts, different goals, but much like federalism, sometimes we take sympathy with the idea of confederation as opposed to federation, because confederation allows us to be different first and then talk to each other only about the things that we want to talk to each other about, and then be able to go back and govern our own affairs after that. But federalism gets a bad name in American jurisprudence. People think that federalism is the hijacking of the autonomy of the different units of the United States. It's how these United States became the United States, But federalism is getting a good portrayal here by Hart and Negri, because they believe that it's this sort of ability to bind everyone within the same juridical process, within the same constitutive process. That's central here. You want the ideal system is not a system based on you being you and me being me and us only talking about the things that we want to talk about. It's about being properly together and establishing a consensus among all of us, where we are all equal but different within this part of the process. So there's no retreat to go back home and not talk to you about the things that I don't want to talk to you about. We are engaged in a form of consensus-making politics, and we are going to live together in this sort of world of the common. So that's a key point, I think, that I think distinguishes Hart and Negri here, that they're very ambitious in the way that they hope to have all of us on board with this, incorporating our difference all the time in this interaction, or in this space of the encounter or the encampment. Another interesting point then is the decision. How are decisions reached? Well, Hart and Negri obviously know that just as well as I do or you do, that the decisions in the Occupy system were reached through a kind of an anarchistic process. But what we've called lowercase a as opposed to capital case A anarchism, and I've called that to you before, horizontal politics. But Hart and Negri believe that in order to understand how decisions are reached in Occupy, it's actually better to start looking at how what conditions must have been in place in order for Occupy to come into existence in the first place. First, there had to be the realization of a doing with others. And of course, the doing with others is just basically a sort of an axiomatic thing, right? It's that if that hadn't been there, Occupy would never have happened, right? So they don't care to go down there and survey people to see if there was a doing with in their heads at the time that they came out to demonstrate. No, it's true by definition. You just wouldn't have had Occupy without an ability for people to sort of get out there and feel like they were doing with others, getting along with, but also doing things with others. So that's important. And then, as a result of all that, you had individuals, but engaging in a common framework, making decisions to break with the regime of indebtedness, to refuse to pay their debts, to refuse to participate in the media, to refuse to be afraid of the government's fear machine and securitization machine, and refusal to vote, refusal to give power over to representatives who are only going to corrupt that power in the first place. So that's an important selling point, I think, for Hart and Negri, of their ideas here, that if we get fussy about it and we try to look too carefully at the decision-making process, we miss the way decisions were made. The big decisions were made, right? Because the big decisions was the decision to come together to do with others, and then the other was, of course, the idea to break with the regime. And those being the two big decisions, and the memory of those big decisions being there now in a way that it wasn't, say, 2 or 3 years ago, because it hadn't happened yet. Then the question Hart and Negri put on the table is, even if the multitudes disappear now, or they go quiet for a while, they retire, or they wind down for a little while, and the parties try to absorb them, or they try to co-opt them, They're not gone. They've been gone before, but they've come back. And what we should take from this is the courage to know that they're coming back again. This brings back to the old mole metaphor. The mole buries down under the ground, tunnels away, and you don't know where he's going to come up. But he does come up, and you may not be expecting when it happens, but he does come back. And that's, in a way, Hart and Negri's understanding of history. That this truth is, because of the mole principle, that we can never go back before the occupations now. We will always be living in a time where the occupations happened, and the genie cannot be put back in the bottle. This thing is here to stay, and it's only a question of how it finds its next expression. Well, that's the end of our lecture for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed reading Multitude with you. I really appreciated the fact that you guys came to the Michael Hart talk. I was delighted, in fact. And I hope that this lecture was useful insofar as I feel it can catch you up on some of the more recent developments and the relevancy of more recent writings from Hart and Negri for the current moment we're in with all these occupations and Occupy Wall Streets and Arab Springs and everything. Multitude is a great book because it hits on a lot of these things and sort of shows us the stakes, what we're trying to liberate ourselves from, the type of person we are today with our in our sort of very, very cognitive worker style mentality and modality. But I think Declaration and the talk that we had from Michael Hart are way more current, and then probably as a result far more interesting for you guys. So I'm a little bit sad that we are not going to be discussing this anymore, but we have other books to get on and read, and so I'd like to start working more now on the David Koresh book. We've been ignoring that a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but we'll get back to it now, and we will try to get a little bit caught up in the class. So, okay, folks, take care, and we'll see you in class soon, okay? Bye-bye.